My name is Mabel Owens. I worked 31 years as a registered nurse at Riverside Community Hospital, and when I retired, I thought the hardest part of my life was behind me. I was wrong. My husband, Theodore, passed 8 months before I stopped working. Lung cancer. We had 42 years together, and then one Tuesday morning in October, I was standing in the hospital hallway on my scrubs, and a colleague touched my arm and said, "Mabel, you need to go home." I didn't understand at first. Then I did. After the funeral, after the casserole stopped coming and the phone calls got further apart, I realized something nobody tells you about grief. The silence isn't the worst part. The worst part is realizing that nobody is waiting for you to walk through the door anymore. My daughter, Tamara, lives in Portland. She called every Sunday. That helped. But Sunday is only one day of the week. So when my sister suggested I go back to work, not full-time, just part-time, something to fill the hours, I didn't argue. I wasn't ready to be a grandmother sitting in a quiet house with the television on. I had good years left. I still knew how to be useful. I took a position as a health aid coordinator at a senior living facility in our neighborhood. Administrative work mostly, reviewing care plans, scheduling staff, a little light case management. The hours were 3 in the afternoon until 9 at night, 4 days a week. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me somewhere to be. The building was a 15-minute drive from my house. But I'd never liked driving after dark, not since my eyes started needing the new prescription. The parking lot at that facility was poorly lit, and our neighborhood had seen a few incidents the previous year. Nothing violent, mostly car break-ins, but enough to make me nervous. The first week, I called a cab. The second week, the same driver showed up. His name was Otis. He was maybe 55, quiet, with gray at his temples and a way of driving that made you feel like you were the only person on the road. He didn't pepper me with questions. He didn't play music too loud. He just drove, and every now and then he'd ask something simple. "Cold enough for you tonight?" Or, "You work late like this every day?" And I'd answer, and we'd fall back into comfortable silence. I appreciated that more than I can explain. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes after a long marriage. You're not lonely for noise. You're lonely for someone who knows your rhythms. Otis didn't know my rhythms, but he respected the quiet. That counted for something. By the third week, I started bringing him coffee. Just a thermos, nothing fancy. I made it the way I liked mine. Dark roast, 1 sugar, a little cream. I didn't ask if he wanted it. I just set it in the cup holder on my way into the back seat and said, "It gets cold waiting out here." He looked at the thermos, then at me in the rearview mirror, and gave a slow nod like I had confirmed something he already suspected about me. After that, the coffee was just part of our arrangement. I brought it every night I worked. He never asked me to. I never made a production of it. It was just a small thing between two people trying to get through the week. His real name, I learned over the following months, was Otis Delaney. He had driven for the same car service for 11 years. Before that, he'd worked loading docks at a distribution warehouse until his back gave out. He had a daughter in college, first in the family, and he talked about her the way you talk about something you worked your whole life for and aren't quite ready to believe is real. Her name was Simone. Pre-law. Second year. I told him about Theodore exactly once. He listened without interrupting. At the end, he said, 42 years is something, that was all. But the way he said it, I knew he understood what I meant, which was that 42 years is also something to lose. We didn't speak about it again. We didn't need to. The months moved. November. December. There was a stretch in January when the weather was ugly and I thought about cutting my hours, but I didn't. Coming home at 9 was hard enough. Having nowhere to go at 3 in the afternoon was worse. At the facility, my job had started to get complicated. When I first arrived, I was handed a simple caseload, coordinating schedules, checking compliance with care plans, reviewing the files of residents whose families had flagged concerns. Standard administrative work. I had done more complex things with a stethoscope and a cart of medications in a busy hospital ward. I wasn't worried, but in December I started noticing things. One resident, a woman named Harriet in room 14. I'll use her first name because she has since passed and her family gave permission for her story to be told. Had a care plan that listed a specific physical therapy regimen, 2 sessions per week with a licensed therapist. The billing showed it. The schedule showed it. But when I started cross-referencing the nursing staff's daily notes, the sessions weren't there. Not in the notes, not in the visitor logs, not in the physical therapist's sign-in records. Harriet was being billed for services she never received. I pulled 2 more files. Same pattern. Then a third. A fourth. 11 residents in total. Elderly, most with some form of cognitive decline. Families who lived out of state. Nobody was likely to notice. The billing went through a contractor, a man named Ray Culver, who ran a rehabilitation services company that had contracts with several facilities in the county. I'd never met him in person. His name appeared on invoices, on contracts, on the quarterly compliance reports I had been reviewing since I started. Everything looked clean on paper. But the paper was the problem. The paper was all there was. I sat at my desk on a Wednesday night in February, a stack of files in front of me and my coffee going cold, and I thought, someone has to do something about this. And then I thought, I am the someone. I make copies. I brought them home in my work bag, a little at a time so it didn't look like anything. I was a nurse for 31 years. I had filled out incident reports, contacted licensing boards, spoken up in hospital meetings when something wasn't right. I wasn't afraid of bureaucracy, but I also knew that going to the wrong person at the wrong time could make the problem disappear along with you. I was careful. I contacted the state long-term care ombudsman's office directly. I sent documents. I asked for confidentiality. They acknowledged receipt, said the matter would be reviewed. I kept my head down and waited. What I did not know was that Ray Culver had a contact inside the facility, the assistant director, a man I had known only as someone who smiled too wide in staff meetings and brought donuts on Fridays. His name was Dennis Greer. He had been with the facility for 6 years. He was the one who signed off on the quarterly compliance reports, the same reports I had been reading. I found this out later. At the time, all I knew was that things started feeling strange. In early March, a filing cabinet in my office had been moved. Just slightly, enough that the bottom drawer stuck when it hadn't before. I thought I was imagining it. Then I noticed my desk lamp had been adjusted. The angle was different. Small things. The kind of things that make you feel like you're losing your mind. Then I noticed the car. There was a dark blue sedan that had started appearing on my block. Not every night, maybe 3 times a week, always parked facing my house. I told myself it was a neighbor I didn't recognize, someone new. But it was always the same car, always in the same spot, always gone by morning. I mentioned it to my daughter during our Sunday call. She said I should call the non-emergency police line. I said I would. I didn't, because I didn't have anything concrete to give them, and I was afraid of sounding like a paranoid old woman. I didn't tell Otis. He was my driver, not my confidant. I didn't want to burden him with something I wasn't even sure was real. But Otis noticed things. He was the kind of man who noticed things because his survival had depended on it for most of his life. He'd grown up in circumstances where you read rooms and read people, or you didn't make it through the week. He drove the same neighborhoods every night for 11 years. He knew what belonged and what didn't. On a Thursday night in mid-March, he picked me up at 9:15 as usual. The air was cold and damp, and I was tired in the way that goes deeper than sleep can fix. I got into the back seat, set the thermos in the cup holder, and closed my eyes for a minute before putting on my seatbelt. We were 3 blocks from my house when I noticed we weren't slowing down. My streak came and went. I sat up. Otis, you missed the turn. He didn't answer right away. He kept driving, steady and unhurried, like he had somewhere in mind. Otis. I know, he said. What do you mean, you know? Take me home. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, and there was something in his face I hadn't seen before. Not nervousness exactly. Something more deliberate. He said, that blue Pontiac has been parked outside your house since 6 o'clock. Same one I've seen there before. I went very still. He said, a man got out when I turned onto your block. He walked toward your front door, and then he stopped and waited. Like he was listening for something. When he saw my headlights coming, he went back to the car. I didn't say anything. My hands were in my lap, and I was aware of how cold my fingers were. I've driven you home 60-something times, Otis said. I know your block. That car doesn't belong there, I said slowly. How long have you been noticing it? 3 weeks, he said. Maybe 4. He drove us to a 24-hour diner 2 miles from my house. He parked under the lights in the front lot and turned around in his seat to face me properly for the first time in all the months I had known him. You want to tell me what's going on? He asked. I did. I told him everything. The files, the billing fraud, the copies I had made, the ombudsman's office. Dennis Greer, whose name I still didn't know was connected, but who I was beginning to suspect knew more than he should. Otis listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without reacting dramatically, just listening. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have copies at your house?" "Yes. Any copies anywhere else?" I hadn't thought of that. I said no. He said, "First thing tomorrow, you send those to someone you trust. A lawyer, your daughter, anybody. You don't want those documents to only be in one place." That night, he waited in his car outside the diner while I called my daughter. I told her everything, all of it. The things I had kept from her for weeks out of some stubborn need to handle things myself. She was quiet for a long moment and then she said, "Mama, I'm coming home." I told her she didn't have to. She said, "I know I don't have to." Otis drove me to a hotel that night. Not a fancy one. A clean, ordinary place off the highway where I paid cash for one night. I sat on the edge of the bed with my work bag in my lap for a long time before I could make myself lie down. The next morning, I emailed copies of everything to Tamara, to my attorney, and to the state attorney general's elder care fraud hotline, which I found after 20 minutes of searching. I also, finally, called the non-emergency police line and told them about the car. What happened after that took several weeks to fully unfold, and I will tell it the way it happened, rather than the way it sounds in a television movie. Ray Culver was investigated by the state attorney general's office. The inquiry eventually expanded to include 4 facilities where his company held contracts. Dennis Greer was identified as an internal contact who had flagged my employment record and my home address after I made the ombudsman report. He had passed that information to someone connected to Culver's operation. The man in the blue Pontiac was a low-level operative. I'll use that word because I don't know what else to call him, who had been sent to determine what I had at home and whether I was a risk. He was eventually questioned by investigators. He was not charged, but he was named in the civil case that followed. Culver was charged with Medicaid fraud. Multiple counts. The case is still working through the courts. My attorney told me I had done everything right and some things that were reckless. I told her that at 63, with 31 years of nursing and 42 years of marriage behind me, I had a pretty good sense of when to be reckless. Now here's the part I want to tell you about Otis. In all the months I had known him, he had mentioned his son exactly twice. The first time it was a passing reference. He said something about "my boy," and then moved on quickly, the way you do when you've decided not to go somewhere. The second time, he mentioned that his son lived about 40 minutes north and that they didn't speak often. He said it in the same flat, careful tone people use when they've made a kind of peace with something that still hurts. I didn't pry. It wasn't my place. But the week after everything with the police and the investigators, when things had calmed down enough that I could breathe again, Otis drove me home from a very long meeting with my attorney. It was a Friday night, and the city was doing what it does on Friday nights. Restaurants lit up, music from somewhere, people dressed for something. We drove through it quietly. At one point, he said, out of nowhere, "My son called me." I waited. He said, "His mother and I separated when he was 11. He's 31 now. He called me last week. First time in 4 years." He paused. He saw a news article about the investigation. My name wasn't in it, but he knew the facility because his grandmother had lived there for a short time, years back. He called to see if I knew anything about it. I told him I drove the woman who reported it. Another pause. We talked for an hour and 40 minutes. I didn't say anything for a moment. Outside the window, a group of young people were crossing the street laughing about something. The light turned green. "Are you going to talk again?" I asked. "Next Sunday," he said. "He wants to bring his kids. He has 2 grandchildren, ages 4 and 7. He had never met them." I looked out the window so he wouldn't see my face. I am not a woman who cries easily, but I was not entirely successful. When we pulled up to my house, the ordinary, quiet house on the ordinary block where a car no longer sat in the dark waiting, I gathered my bag and my thermos and I said, "I'm glad he called." Otis gave that slow nod he always gave, the one that meant more than it showed. I got out of the car. I stood on my front porch for a moment and watched the taillights until they were gone. There are things I want to say now that I couldn't have said 2 years ago before Theodore died, before I went back to work, before any of this. I want to say that kindness is not a personality trait. It's a choice, made repeatedly, in small moments that don't feel important at the time. A thermos of coffee. A nod in the dark. 60-something rides home without complaint. I want to say that paying attention is one of the most radical things a person can do. Not surveillance, not suspicion. Just attention. The kind that says, "I see you. I notice when something is wrong. You are not invisible to me." Otis didn't save me because he was a hero. He saved me because he was paying attention. Because he had driven me home enough times that he knew what my street looked like when something was off. Because a cup of coffee, handed over in silence once a week, had made us the kind of people who looked out for each other. I still work at the facility, different management now, under oversight. Things changed. I still take a car service home most nights. Otis is still my driver when his schedule allows. Last spring, he showed me a picture on his phone, a cookout, his daughter Simone in a law school sweatshirt, his son standing next to him with a hand on his shoulder, two small children in the grass with paper plates. Otis was in the center of the frame, slightly self-conscious the way people are when they're not used to being photographed. He looked happy, not performed happy. Quietly, privately, genuinely happy. I told him it was a good picture. He said, "Yeah, it is." That was enough. Be kind. Not because the world will always reward you for it, and not because you'll always see the return. Be kind because it makes you the kind of person that others notice when you are in danger. Because it builds, quietly and without ceremony, the kind of trust that holds when things go wrong. Be observant, not just of threats, but of people, of the small things that tell the truth about someone's life, of the cup that's empty and the light that's off and the car that doesn't belong. And take care of each other. That's really all I have to say. My name is Mabel Owens. I am 64 years old. I am a retired nurse, a widow, a mother, and a woman who makes a very good dark roast. And I am here, still, because someone was paying attention. I have spent a lot of time thinking about how close things came to going another way. If I had never brought that first thermos of coffee. If Otis had been the kind of man who kept his eyes only on the road and nothing else. If I had stayed silent about those files, told myself it wasn't my problem, that I was too old and too tired and too newly alone to go looking for trouble. Any one of those things, and I would have walked up to my front door on an ordinary Thursday night in March, and I don't know what would have happened next. I do know I might not be here to tell this. What I keep coming back to is not the danger. It's the chain. Every small choice I made led to the next one. I brought Otis coffee because it was cold and he was waiting outside, and it seems like the decent thing to do. That's it. There was no strategy behind it. I wasn't trying to build an alliance or protect myself or set anything in motion. I was just a woman who didn't like the idea of someone sitting out in the cold with nothing warm to drink. That's the whole story of how it started, and yet. Because of that thermos, Otis paid attention to me in a way he might not have otherwise, not romantically. I want to be clear about that, but in the way that you pay attention to someone who has shown you a small and consistent kindness. You notice when something is off. You notice the car that doesn't belong. You notice because that person has, without meaning to, become someone to you. That is not luck. That is cause and effect. I think about this when people say no good deed goes unpunished, which is a saying I have always found deeply cynical and mostly wrong. Good deeds don't guarantee safety. They don't guarantee anything, but they change the texture of your relationships quietly over time. They make you visible to the people around you in a way that carelessness never does. And I think about the courage it took, not mine, but the courage it takes to do what is right when it would be so much easier not to. I found those billing records and I had a choice. I was 63 years old. I was still grieving. I had a daughter in Portland and a quiet house and a part-time job I could have kept my head down in until it was time to collect my pension. Nobody was asking me to do anything. Nobody would have blamed me for looking the other way, but there were 11 people in that facility who had no one watching out for them. And I had spent 31 years as a nurse, which means I had spent 31 years believing that the person in front of you deserves your best effort, whether or not it is convenient to give it. I was not going to unlearn that because I was tired. Otis's son called him because a newspaper mentioned the investigation. One phone call, 4 years of silence broken, 2 grandchildren now sitting in the grass at a cookout. That is what ripples look like. You do not get to see most of them. You do one small right thing, and it moves through the world in directions you will never track. Pay attention to people. Do the decent thing even when it's inconvenient. Speak up when something is wrong, even when it's frightening. None of this is complicated. All of it is hard, and all of it matters more than you will ever fully know.